April 1912, North Atlantic. Calm sea, a star-packed sky, and Titanic moving forward like a lit-up city. At 11:40 p.m., the impact is not a head-on collision. It is a long, quiet scrape along the ice. Why do so many people barely notice, while a few already understand that time just became the enemy? If you want to see, minute by minute, what really happened after the iceberg, like the video and subscribe to the channel, because now we're stepping into this timeline as faithfully as possible. Inside, the night still feels normal. Perfect service, soft music, footsteps on carpet, voices kept low. And that's the trap, because normal is a sedative. It makes your brain explain away the strange just to protect comfort. On an ocean liner, every section lives in a different world. Luxury up top, heavy labor down below. Most people never see what's happening outside their own corridor. The thing is, the ship speaks in small signals. Vibration, rhythm, pressure, noises that shift. Have you ever ignored a warning because it felt like nothing? Here, that kind of self-deception costs time. And time, on this night, is the only currency you never get back. Up on deck, the cold cuts straight through you, and the view can lie. With the sea that calm, ice shows up late, with no foam to give it away. On the bridge, there is no perfect move when the clock is short and the ship is massive. There is only the best reaction you can manage. The contact comes in the most dangerous way to recognize. Not a slam. A long, almost clean scrape along the side. In warm lounges, it sounds like nothing. In the structure, it can be everything. And that's where the mental fight begins. Do you believe in the size of the ship? Or do you believe what the signals are telling you? From here on out, every minute becomes a test of decision. And that beautiful night starts turning into a technical problem. Down on the lower decks, reality arrives with no poetry. Lamps flare on, footsteps turn into a run, and water appears where it has no business being. The first response is technical, almost cold. Measure, check seams, compare levels, track the rate of intake. But when water starts entering in sequence through critical spaces, leak becomes progression. The team tries to contain it, marks reference points, seals passages, and buys seconds the hard way. And you can feel the ship changing, even when nobody says a word. The vibration is not the same anymore. Have you ever watched a problem turn huge because people took too long to accept the diagnosis? Here, that delay is expensive, and the clock does not forgive. When the watertight doors begin to drop, the situation jumps to a new level. Heavy steel sealing off compartments to buy time. At the same time, the illusion of control has to stay intact because panic can destroy any evacuation. The crew starts guiding people quietly, moving them without turning it into a stampede. But below, water is already pushing on doors and swallowing stair steps, turning the work into something brutally physical. From the outside, the ship still looks whole. Inside, it is being redesigned by water. And then the uncomfortable question shows up. Do you trust what you can see? Or what's happening out of sight? At this point, the danger is not just the ice. It is the delay in accepting what the numbers are showing. Evacuation begins by colliding with instinct. Stepping into a small lifeboat feels more dangerous than staying on a giant ship. So you get hesitation, disbelief. This is just precaution. Even that calm that's almost irritating from people who think there's plenty of time. But the deck starts telling a different story. Tiny imbalances, objects that won't stay put, a tilt your body notices before your mind admits it. The crew forces order. life jackets, lines, firm instructions. Because without flow, nobody gets out. And every lifeboat that goes down changes the air. The problem becomes real, final, undeniable. Have you ever noticed how reality updates the moment the first concrete action happens? That's exactly what this is. And the time window starts shrinking. The moment a lifeboat drops, the cold stops being scenery and becomes an active enemy. Stiff hands, ropes groaning, pulleys screaming, wood knocking hard against metal. The margin for error is razor thin, because a swinging boat can turn into tragedy fast. On the bridge, the night still looks calm through the windows, and that can fool you. But inside the ship, the vibration has already changed. This is the kind of moment where your mind insists, there's still time. Except still starts getting short. Really short, and the ship does not announce its danger. It warns you with subtle signals that only grow louder. In this phase, the people who understand that move fast without looking panicked. It's a thin line. The operation finds a rhythm and turns almost mechanical. Redistribute lines, steady boats, control descents, avoid impact against the hull. The deck gets more crowded, and the challenge is keeping direction clear with cutting wind and confused people. Each boat that pulls away feels like a slice taken out of everyone else's sense of safety, and that changes how the remaining crowd behaves. Meanwhile, water keeps pushing from inside, forcing retreats and improvisation. Like the ship is losing territory one section at a time. Have you ever seen a team working at the absolute limit while trying to look calm, just so they don't infect everyone else with fear? Here, that calm is part of the plan, and even with a glassy sea, the tension keeps rising. The problem is visible now. Decision-making turns into hard logistics. Maps, messages, runners sprinting, narrow corridors, stairwells packed tight. The ship that felt like a hotel becomes a moving labyrinth, with choke points and routes that shift from easy to impossible. Down below, the technical crews are working in extreme conditions. Rising water, limited light, tight spaces. Up on deck, the contrast stays unreal. Clear sky, smooth sea, and the ship's posture is clearly changing. On the bridge, looking out the window still shows night. Watching the ship's behavior shows something else entirely. Do you trust what you see or what you feel? This is where "it'll be fine" starts sounding like a gamble. And a gamble is not a plan. Lifeboats become the real line between possible and too late, and that creates uneven, brutal choices. Some people step in fast, some freeze, some glance back like the size of the ship is a guarantee. The crew pushes the process forward because hesitation becomes a bottleneck, and a bottleneck becomes people trapped. The sound of ropes and pulleys takes over the air, mixed with wind. Like the evacuation has its own soundtrack, made entirely of wood and metal. Have you ever noticed how the mind tries to deny the obvious when the obvious is too big to hold? Here, it happens in real time, and the tilt starts interfering with something as basic as walking across the deck. Disbelief starts losing ground. At this point, the deck becomes a survival assembly line. Knot tight, boat stabilized, controlled descent, oars in the water, pull away. And there's something deeply human in it. The most important move can be as simple as taking a step and not stopping. Because what comes next is more physical, more tense, and the margin for error disappears fast. The angle increases, objects start sliding on their own, and control becomes a memory. And when the structure starts to complain, no amount of comfort can hold it together. All that's left is procedure and instinct. If you're following this reconstruction and you want me to keep it at this exact level of detail, like the video and subscribe. It genuinely helps keep this series alive and done right. On deck, the operation enters an unforgiving phase. Do everything faster while the ship grows less stable. The tilt stops being a detail and becomes constant interference. You feel it in your ankles, your balance, the way your feet land. The crew has to keep people moving and prevent confusion because any pause creates crowding, and crowding creates panic. At the same time, water keeps climbing on the lower decks, pushing the technical teams up step by step. On the bridge, the picture is clear. When the bow is being pulled down like that, there's no easy recovery. Have you ever seen a problem that gives you only two options? Act now, or pay later. Here, later arrives fast, and the night starts getting short. From far away, Titanic still looks like a bright city in the middle of nowhere, and that image is a lie. The lower bow starts revealing itself, and the calm sea makes it even more obvious, because there are no waves to hide anything. From the lifeboats, the ship looks bigger than ever, and that messes with your head. How can something that huge be losing this fight? Distance can show the truth more clearly than being trapped inside the maze. And the question shows up on its own. Do you trust the size or the behavior of the ship? In this early morning, the answer is technical, and technical does not negotiate. Now the angle changes simple things. Climbing stairs takes strength. Opening doors takes more grip. Walking takes focus. Objects begin to slide, and that hits psychologically, because it's physical proof the ship is losing its neutrality. The crew pushes people upward, because higher decks still have organization and access to boats. Below, the water is already high, and the technical teams shift into a controlled retreat, trying to keep you know what working for as long as they possibly can. On the bridge, the instruments vibrate in a way nobody wants to see. Have you ever felt that moment of this is it? It starts here, even if some still refuse to admit it. The whole ship feels like it's in a countdown, but nobody announces the number. This is where the bow takes over everything. It sinks deeper, drags the ship, and the pace of events accelerates. The sound of metal under stress becomes a continuous warning, like the structure itself is saying it has reached its limit. The lights start to fail and create a new kind of fear. Flicker, return, surge, drop. It shakes any sense of order. On deck, the angle makes people slip, forces hands onto rails, and changes the way crews work the ropes. Ever get that chill down your spine when something massive loses stability, and you feel it before it happens? Here, it's shared. And from this point on, it's not about comfort anymore. It's about gravity and time. The ship's final sequence is fast and brutal. The structure fails, the hull breaks, and what was one body becomes two enormous masses. The sound is the opposite of silence. Metal tearing, steam venting, water moving in tons. And the lights collapse. They fail in waves until darkness replaces the glowing city. The bow is gone. What remains fights for a moment, then gives in. It's hard to process because the scale is gigantic, but the time is short. Have you ever noticed how the brain takes too long to accept an impossible while it's happening right in front of you? Here, there's no time to accept it. There's only time to survive. From the lifeboats, Titanic becomes shadow and distance, and the ocean becomes the only ground you have. The stern loses what's left of its support, the water churns, and then the sea tries to close the wound like nothing happened. The priority becomes separation and stability. Don't capsize. Don't collide with debris. Don't drift into the turbulence. The cold is no longer discomfort. It's a constant threat that clings to your breathing and your hands. And then the fragments appear. Wood, fabric, objects floating with no owner. It's a blunt scene, painfully real. The sea returns pieces, not explanations. And even with calm water, everything feels unstable. Because what vanished wasn't just a ship. After the ship disappears, the night changes its sound, and that weight hits hard. In the boats, searching in the dark becomes a careful attempt. Look, listen, separate debris from movement, shadow from a person. But every approach carries real risk, because an unstable lifeboat can become another tragedy. Sometimes crews force silence to hear better, and that tells you everything about the tension. Have you ever had to choose with little information and a huge cost attached? Here, that's the rule. Bodies are at the limit. The cold ruins clear thinking. And still, someone has to decide. The early morning drags on like time got thick, but it never stops. The early hours switch into pure survival mode. Row slowly, conserve energy, hold direction, stay within reach of the others. The sea is calm, but the cold works non-stop, changing behavior and focus. Your mind slows down. Your body wants to save every ounce. The landscape is almost empty. A few lantern points, a hard horizon line, pieces of wood floating like quiet confirmation. And there's a cruel detail. After the chaos, the ocean looks normal again far too quickly. But for the people out there, nothing is normal. Every minute is a fight to stay conscious. Ever felt your body bargaining with you like, just a little longer? Here, that bargain never ends, and the horizon becomes an obsession. With the ship gone, the Atlantic becomes enormous and indifferent, and it hits different. In the boats, attention splits between searching for any light and fighting trembling, exhaustion, and disorientation. Weak lanterns create a small island of order, even if they can't beat the cold. It's more psychological than physical, but it helps. Debris drifts by like proof of a night that won't come back, and every floating piece is a reminder. The starry sky stays there, like nothing changed, and honestly, it can make you angry. From here, the story shifts into waiting and rescue, and every minute feels bigger than it should. But the clock keeps moving, and the body feels every second. When light arrives, it doesn't bring instant relief. It brings clarity. What was darkness becomes a field of distant lifeboats and scattered debris, like the sea turned into an inventory. The calm water clashes with what happened, and it messes with your mind. It feels like the world kept going, and only the people out there stayed trapped in that night. Dawn also exposes the scale of isolation. No land, no reference, just horizon. Have you ever noticed how morning can be cruel when it arrives too soon? Here, every look outward becomes the same repeated question. Is anyone coming? And without a word spoken, you can feel exhaustion stacking in layers. Rescue begins in the simplest possible way, a point on the horizon that grows slowly, forcing everyone to believe again. After hours in the cold, hope becomes a slow mechanism. Your brain tries to conserve itself so it doesn't break. As the ship closes in, everything turns technical. A thrown line, a firm rope, a careful approach, a climb up a ladder, hands gripping hands. There's no glamour. It's practical, heavy, and done by people who can barely stop shaking. Even with calm seas, every transfer carries risk. One slip, one imbalance, and you lose someone else. And that's when finally becomes real, almost physical. Because for the first time in hours, there's structure again. And that changes everything. On board the rescue ship, priorities are immediate and basic: warmth, organization, counting, stabilization, blankets, hot drinks, a place to sit, someone watching for hypothermia. It sounds simple, but it's the line between recovery and collapse. Meanwhile, the radio doesn't stop because information saves too. Alert, log, coordinate. Shock shows up in the details. Hands that won't stop trembling. Eyes that take too long to focus. Movements that feel delayed. Ever felt your body shut down after a massive surge of stress? Here, it becomes collective. And a warm cabin doesn't erase icy water from memory right away. Order returns slowly, but the inner silence in each person remains. The story starts shifting settings, from the sea to the records. At the port, the story turns loud and crowded. Wet docks, bodies packed tight, workers pulling lines, volunteers clearing space. The arrival isn't a victory. It's a hard landing back into reality, with people trying to understand what happened before they can even catch their breath. Some walk off slowly, others need support. The press hunts for any sign of what was lost. The dock becomes a corridor of tension, because every person who arrives confirms for someone waiting who didn't. Ever notice how a port can feel huge and small at the same time? Huge with people, small with answers. The world demands an explanation fast, but the body is still stuck in the night. Even a single footstep can sound heavy. Then comes the phase without the ocean, but with the same weight. Investigation, documents, testimony, mechanics. The disaster becomes a study, Compartments, communications, lifeboat capacity, protocols, the exact sequence of decisions. Everything has to be rebuilt with precision because impression doesn't change policy. Evidence does. The room has a different kind of cold: wood, paper, ink, people trying to stay neutral while measuring consequences. The central question is direct. Where did the system fail? And where did decision-making fail with it? There isn't one single villain. There's a stack of factors that fit badly at the worst possible moment, and that stack has to be recorded to become change. This is where tragedy starts turning into procedure. And when procedure is done right, it prevents repetition. The consequences show up away from headlines, in the back rooms: inspections, training, standardized communication, route reviews, equipment built and checked with a new mindset. It's the least dramatic part, but it's the part that actually reshapes the future, because safety becomes habit when it becomes law. The industry starts treating lifeboats, radio, and drills as mandatory, not optional. Ever notice how safety only becomes urgent after something goes wrong? Yeah. Here, the price of learning was far too high. The goal becomes clear: reduce dependence on luck, increase dependence on procedure. Even with no ocean on screen, this is the real continuation of the story, because the disaster doesn't end with the sinking. It continues in what changes afterward. In the end, what remains is material and memory: objects stained by seawater, worn fabric, marked metal, fragments of a night nobody wanted to document, and the sea returns to normal too fast, like it could erase everything, which creates a strange sense of injustice. But it doesn't erase it, because the change lives on in rules, in testimony, and in the way we look at technology and trust. If a ship that large vanished in a few hours, what does that say about certainty and control? The answer is simple and hard. Engineering helps, but it doesn't erase risk. And the environment doesn't make concessions. The final image is calm, almost silent. But the conclusion sticks. The ocean doesn't negotiate, and history doesn't forget.
This video was an AI-assisted historical reconstruction based on records from the time, created for artistic and narrative purposes.